Okay, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to our third webinar, which will be dedicated to the topic of assessment and feedback. And basically what we would like to suggest today is to have an exchange of teaching practice, drawing from our teaching practice, to discuss the three main questions suggested by Alex and myself, as well as the group leaders, regarding the assessment and feedback. So the first question that we would like to address today is, what are we aiming to assess? Because bearing in mind the variety of learning objectives, we usually assess different things we expect our students to have learned throughout our courses. So either we talk about the testing of the knowledge they are expected to acquire during the course, or whether we talk about assessing the way they perform in a simulation game, as well as assessing the skills, for example, writing skills. Our main aim is to check whether students understood the message we wanted to transmit in our course. The second main question is, how do we assess? Basically, what assessment tools and methods do we use? This is very much linked to the first question. Basically, what specific aspects of the learning experience we want to assess. We may use, for example, a multiple choice test to assess the student's ability of analysis, but of course this is obviously not the best solution. So therefore we need to design the right tools and methods for assessing student performance, and this is very often linked and somehow constrained also by the teaching method we used. So for example, whether we use PBL simulations or blended learning e-learning, we somehow differ regarding the tools that we can apply to assess our students and to provide feedback. And the third question is regarding the feedback, both the so-called formative feedback given along the way, of continuous feedback, basically step-by-step feedback, which aims at supporting the students throughout their learning process, and the summative feedback, which resumes to essentially grades at the end of the term, or like, for example, the final exam. Both this dichotomic formative and summative feedback often reflect our philosophy about education, and therefore offering the right feedback at the right moment can make a huge difference in the learning outcomes and the overall experience students take away from our courses. Today's structure suggested by the group leaders is to basically focus our discussion on each of these three questions so that we could have a cross-group discussion but focused on each of these three questions. So as you could see, one of the changes, organizational changes of the webinar compared to the previous one, is we shortened it from the originally planned 2 hours to 1.5 hours. So since we have three main questions, we are expected to discuss around 20 minutes, 25, each question, and we welcome the contributions from our groups of training participants. You can post your contribution either in a written form via the chat, or you can raise your hand and we would give you the floor to talk if you are equipped with a microphone, and for example optional also with a webcam. So we will proceed anyway discussing question one and giving the floor to each of the group leaders, and Alexandra will be helping today with following the online posts, and we will be sharing the moderator's roles with Alexandra today. So I would like to give the floor now to Simon or Heidi, as you wish, to start addressing question 1 regarding your group.
Okay, I can start if you're happy with that. So the first question is, what are we trying to assess? So I've got some thoughts, but also very helpfully, Ihor has produced some notes which we discussed during last week. So I'm going to start off actually with what Ihor has to say, because I think it's a useful point to think about. Um, when we're talking about these kind of pedagogies, we need to remember that there are two different aspects here. One is about knowledge and understanding of the subject material, but the other is also the more surrounding kind of issues of skills development, of student confidence, things like that, which are potentially very useful, particularly for simulation games, but also I think for PBL, that the process of the pedagogy is as important a part of what we're doing as is actually the content of what we're doing. So here, Ihor has talked about the spectrum of assessment in simulations can be very diverse potentially, but for him, the two main points were checking prior knowledge and also the student's ability to communicate and work in a team. So really, these two different aspects: the knowledge and the skills. So here it's really being sure that students have understood the kind of thing that we want to communicate through our teaching, through the kind of environments and opportunities that we give them. The difficulty here, and I think it's maybe one that Heidi will share, is that often we're not entirely sure what it is students will discuss or how they'll discuss it. And so I think one of the things we might want to think about is how do we make sure that students are roughly in the right kind of area. And this is something we talked about in previous webinars, but I think it's something that we need to think about with assessment as well, that our assessment, usually we have to tell our universities sometime in advance what our assessment is going to be before we actually get to the assessment point, which means we need to think about a framework of assessment that is flexible enough to let us capture those different things. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Simon. Perhaps some simulations group participants would like to elaborate on that and share their experiences. Alex, as far as I understand so far, we do not have any posts that were perhaps written in our chat worth sharing.
We encourage participants to share their thoughts on chat as usual, like in the previous webinars where everyone was extremely active. But I think for the moment we can continue probably with the group leaders' short statements, and then we go to the participants as well. Or they can write meanwhile. In any case, everyone is encouraged to write meanwhile.
Okay, thank you. Heidi, would you like to go next? And then Alexandra would elaborate from our behalf on question 1.
Okay, good afternoon. And I perhaps want to take the opportunity to briefly follow up on what Simon was saying, and then also hand over to two colleagues who volunteered to participate today, to Galina and also Lisanne. But I just briefly wanted to follow up on these what questions, because in Maastricht, what we experienced during the last few years was attention on 3 levels when it came to assessing active learning. And 2 of them, I think Simon already mentioned. So there's one idea of, do you assess content only, or do you assess content and skills development? And the second one, and I think it was implied in Simon's comments, what we are really thinking a lot about now is, do we assess the status quo at the end of the learning activity, or do we take the learning process of the student into account? And I think that becomes more and more important the more diverse your group of students is. So what we see in Maastricht is that some of our colleagues in the end judge of how much progress students made in active learning, whereas especially assessment criteria are very much targeted towards assessing towards an objective level. And that's really something that we struggle with. The third tension, I think, is a bit more inherent in active learning, and I think it's this idea that in the end it's students who should define what they want to learn. And to what extent can we take this into account? And Simon was already mentioned, most of us have to actually submit exams way before the learning activity is over. So that's really also a third tension that we see, that on the one hand we want students to define their own learning trajectory, while at the same time we very much come with our objective standardized criteria that are often given to us even by government. So these were just the three things that I wanted to add. And if you agree, I would then just invite also the other colleagues from the PBL group to follow up.
Thank you. So please raise your hand in case you would like to follow up on Heidi's points. Yes, Lizanne, please go ahead.
Okay, does my microphone work? Yeah, you can hear me? Okay. Thanks already for everybody who spoke before, and I think already a lot has been said on the topic. I agree that indeed there are two types of things you can assess. Indeed, the knowledge on the subject in the first place, which is in any case important, and then for the problem-based learning, I think also the specific skills that you want to teach have to be assessed. And then actually it depends on the assignment that you develop, which specific skills you want to transmit to the students. And then actually if you specify that already beforehand, that you want to do that with the assignment, then you can actually afterwards also assess it. So for example, you can design an assignment that includes improvement of writing skills or presentation skills as a goal, or teamwork, and then actually afterwards you can really assess to what extent the students improved in these skills during the process. And for example, I had to design my own problem-based learning assignment, and I focused on a topic, and then I actually included in the end that students have to prepare a little report as a sort of outcome of their whole learning process, and then actually you can just assess what the students write in this report, and if you give them very clear guidelines on what you want to include in this report, then actually you can make an assessment of to what extent the students actually follow these guidelines and try to do what you told them to do. Yeah, I think I leave it at this. Thanks.
Thank you, Lisa. Galina, would you like to continue now or later, perhaps?
As you know, our PBL problem-based learning process is divided into 7 steps. And so we have previous discussion in the class, then students will go home, find out the necessary information to help our client to solve the problem in legal environment, and also we will have a post discussion in the class. So I presume that we will have two stages of assessment, as we will encourage understanding of problematic issues in the class when the students for the first time see the problem-based learning that was supplied to them by their tutor. And then we will also foster the critical thinking, which is one of the aims of problem-based learning. And then we will also assess and make assessment of the way how the students debate issues within the problem-based learning, how they weight evidence and how they rank their hypothesis, which kind of legislation can be elaborated to solve the problematic situation. We will also assess and analyze how they present the data and what information was provided, how they synthesize the information, and what is the result of their research work at home. What is also important within the problem-based learning is that because we encourage critical understanding of the problem by the students, we need also to access their motivation of how they structure the problem-based learning and what steps they need to follow in order to find the possible optimal solution to help your client to solve the problem. This I talk within their within the legal environment, because one of the main aims of problem-based learning for lawyers, for LLM students, and for doctoral students is to find the necessary solution within the legislation procedure and to help your client to reach the best outcome. That's why I'm convinced that we need also to access the way of understanding of the problem by the student within the problem-based learning, how they compare different things, how they interpret information, how they seek for information, what decisions they will take, and also we need to guide the students to use their prior knowledge, and also the way how they will use their prior knowledge to construct the new learning, to motivate the new learning, will be also quite useful within the assessment procedure for problem-based learning. Thank you.
Thank you very much. If I understood correctly, Alex will be willing to give a short update of what has been said online. Please go ahead.
Yes, thank you, Natalia. Indeed, I think before I go to answering our question from the point of view of our group, I think I'll just try to summarize a bit the interesting discussion from all of our four speakers so far, and also the ones contributing on the chat. I think indeed the main well, the important thing is to think about whether we test knowledge or content, subject matter, or versus skills development, or we test both. Simon mentioned that they can also be disconnected. They don't need to be necessarily connected. Also, success skills doesn't necessarily translate into success, he mentioned. Another interesting thing, I think, from Heidi was whether we assess the status quo at the end of the course, or we assess the process of learning, and I think that's also very interesting. Also, to what extent do students define, or do we want the students to define what they learn, or do we come with our own learning goals? So that's an interesting balance to think about as well. And then, of course, Natalia mentioned the aims, that the aims of the course have to be very clear, and I think Lisanne also talked about it, because the clearer the aims and the goals are, the easier it is to assess them. And Max introduced another thing we might want to assess, and that's performance. So beside knowledge and skills, we might also want to assess performance. But this is quite difficult because, as Heidi explained quite at length, there are lots of things happening at the same time. In the class, you have to assess, you have to chair, you have to follow the various whatever the various students do in their roles. So it might be very difficult in the end to have performance as part of the assessed things. Then, of course, Galina also mentioned that you have to first encourage the students to understand all the concepts and then help them synthesize and find a way to find the best solution in the end. That's what problem-based learning is about. Then what I see now, Lisanne also mentioned about measuring performance. Again, linked to what Heidi said in the beginning, both in terms of how the process of learning goes and also the final outcome. But again, I think in an ideal world, it sounds easy, but in reality, it might be pretty difficult. So yes, I think for the moment, that's it. I would let the chat move a bit further, and I'll just jump in with my own or our thoughts about how we go about assessment in e-learning and blended learning. Because here we also, I mean, there are quite similar things to what was already said before. We also want to assess and test the knowledge, the content matter, but also there are specific skills that we would like our students to get from the process of learning, studying online. And those are mostly linked to the ability to find and process information online, a sort of digital literacy skills, if you want to call them like that, but also writing skills, why not? That can also be a type of skills tested online, and teamwork as well. But something very important also when you study online is the discipline, the self-discipline. So the self-regulated learning at your own pace, but still following the various tasks and delivering what is asked. I think that's a skill that it's very important when you study online, and I think it's very important to try to assess it as well. How we do it, it's when we answer the next question. But for the moment, I'll leave it at that and continue to follow the chat. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alexandra. I would like to have an open call now for any further contributions. I see Simon has the hand raised. Simon, go ahead.
Okay. Thank you. I think the thing that I'm just getting from the chat is that we when we're thinking about performance, it's really the points that have been made already that a lot of these scenarios are not necessarily designed to allow everybody to succeed in terms of get what they want. And I think this is what we talked about a lot at the last webinar, that failure is also a valuable thing for students to experience, because if we think about our real lives, we don't always get what we want. We have to often deal with situations that are not ones where we have a good chance of success. So the ability to learn from that is just as important, perhaps more important than just, I won, I'm brilliant, I should get a good mark. I think connected to that as well is also the question of how do you measure what it is you're trying to assess. If we think about performance, how well they did, it's Heidi's point, you can't watch a group of people for any length of time and really get all the things that you want to get. And this is something I talked about, I think, back in Brussels at our training session. What is it you are thinking is important in performance? Is it about your ability to speak? Is it about your ability to compromise? It is about your preparation, all these kind of things. So it becomes a very subjective process, more subjective than a lot of the assessment we have. So I'd always want to be very careful about what we're trying to measure. Is it something that we have a good opportunity really to measure? And that's why I think I've suggested several times we should be thinking about other things, either connecting it back to the subject material, or to be getting students to develop reflective pieces of work where they talk about what they've learned. So it's focused more on their perspective rather than ours. And we can then use that as a way to strengthen the kind of skills development side, the reflective learning that I think a lot of us have talked about as a useful kind of thing.
Thank you, Simon. From my side, I would like shortly just to add that while blended learning offers the advantage basically of choosing from multiple teaching methods like face-to-face versus online teaching or teaching tools. At the same time, this comes with the challenge of offering timely feedback and balancing between individual and group feedback. So from the moment of course design in the blended learning, it is very important to have very clear guidelines, clear objectives, and clear basically instructions what would be assessed, how it will be assessed, and some built-in mechanisms that will ensure a constant communication between the tutor and the student, because as the literature shows, basically the lack of so-called timely or prompt and clear feedback from the instructor but also from the peers is considered to be one of the main reasons why students feel isolated or frustrated when being involved in online courses or blended learning courses. So this is the point that I would like to raise with regard to the blended learning group. Now, before we move to the second question, we are doing quite well from the time point of view. I would like to ask Alex if there is anything worth mentioning with regard to question 1, and then we can move to question 2.
Yeah, thank you. Just to wrap up, because a few more interesting ideas came up, and I think it's important to just mention them as well. Max mentioned, but I think also Simon later on, are students more motivated if they are assessed or not? That's something also to keep in mind. And how do we measure what we assess? Exactly what Simon was talking just a few moments ago. The criteria for assessment, I think Lizanne mentioned it, or a few more people. Should we really have very rigid criteria, or should we keep it still a bit flexible? Of course, there are things that can be, there are types of assessments where we can assess in a more objective way, like multiple choice questions, which are, of course, as few of you mentioned, not the preferred choice of method. But again, about methods, we will talk when we answer the next question at length. But at the moment, still on what we assess. Yeah, how do we measure what we want to assess? Some things are a bit more difficult to measure in an objective way. Essays, discussions, debates, they're a bit more subjective. And last but not least, I wanted to mention again and underline what Simon said about the reflective pieces from the students. That's another interesting way of trying to assess what we want to assess from the point of view of the students, of what they think they have learned and how they think the process has worked or not. So again, self-reflecting reflective pieces are very important as well. But that's maybe a good transition towards how we assess, from what we assess.
Yeah, thank you, Alex. Indeed, these questions are all interrelated. Of course, it's impossible to talk about them in isolation, but this does indeed seem to be a good transition to our second question, which is how do we assess? So we welcome your exchange of ideas and experiences regarding the different assessment tools and methods that you use in your teaching within your universities, but especially linking it to the specific training groups that you belong to. And we would like to welcome your reflections on the different assessment tools and methods with regard to simulations, PBL, and blended learning, basically the compatibility or universability of the different methods. To what extent we can apply the same methods or different methods to the different teaching methods. Anyone volunteering to take the floor now from the group leaders?
If you want, I can start this time.
Sorry, Simon had the hand raised. Go ahead, Simon.
Thank you. Sorry, Heidi. Yeah, in terms of how you assess, again, it's very much linked to what you want to assess. I think it's interesting again that all the kinds of assessment that we normally might use outside of these kind of pedagogies we can use, but also we can start to do some other things as well. And I think one of the things that we've thought about with this project is thinking about how we can develop useful skills for students for whatever they choose to do after their studies. So again, here there's opportunity in these kind of pedagogies to develop policy briefings or other kinds of more official kinds of outputs that might match the kind of thing that they do in their chosen profession. So we have some scope to do some novel kind of things. Again, it really depends. The format depends very much on what it is we want to get out of the students. It's interesting, just going back to Eor's comments, which I've also posted up in our forum, so everyone can have a look at them, is thinking about the possibility of differentiated assessment. At one level, using something like a simulation game is actually a very open kind of platform. And you could bring together students from different kinds of levels, so students who are early in their studies, students who are later on in their studies, and they can get something from it. And you could actually run simultaneously different kinds of assessments requirements for different students. Now, Iho, I think, was interesting because he was talking very much about the difficulty of creating simulations where everyone can win or be successful. And so we might want to think about students who are in weak positions. You might want to give them different criteria from students who are in strong positions and thus more likely to be able to succeed. I can see the idea of that, but again, it goes back to this problem we've talked about already, which is assessing performance and success is also a function of what position you're in to start with and what resources you have, some of which may well not be in your control. So here, I think, again, I'd be suggesting stepping back and thinking, rather than evaluating their success, we might want to evaluate their reflection. And there, obviously, essays, term papers is a good kind of way of doing that. The difficulty, again, I think, is that it also becomes rather subjective and uneven. The one person might learn might not seem very much to another person, and so the benchmarking of very different learning experiences becomes more difficult. And I guess that's also a thing with blended learning, where students are having necessarily a much more individual learning experience. So how we capture that, I think, is a difficult kind of tension. Thanks.
Thank you, Simon. Heidi, the floor is yours.
Perfect. Thank you very much. What I find interesting is this question of, do we need different assessment methods in active learning than we use in traditional learning? And I mean, one thing that I actually learned from Simon is it doesn't matter as long as it's aligned. And what you test has to fit what you want to achieve and how you build the course. And I think that goes for traditional learning, but also for active learning. Just three short thoughts from Maastricht of how we experience it, also with problem-based learning. The first thing is really this experience of, well, if we would love to have the most individual assessment tool, but in the end we also have to be efficient, and you also have to have a way of saying, okay, this is not an assessment moment, and perhaps sometimes you do less assessment moments and put actually more time and effort on giving feedback to students, so to facilitate the learning process before that. What I find interesting there is that originally in problem-based learning, you had progressive exams. So you had one exam that you should be able to tackle after 3 years of studies, and every year you were supposed to fulfill more percentage of this exam. We don't use it in Maastricht because it's simply not possible for our program. And also because I think most of our staff members actually think that active learning is one thing, but having an exam moment is still okay to do in a traditional manner. One thing that we though experienced, and it brings me to my second point, is a bit to this: how do we assess? Does this always mean that you have to have the usual grading scheme? And one thing that we experienced is that, especially for the skills trainings, where we want students to experiment, to try, and to have this room for failing, that Simon also was mentioning, we actually only use pass and fail. So students have to to achieve something in order to pass, but it doesn't mean that they have to have the one perfect answer. As long as they try and they have a reason why they tried this way, they normally pass. And it's a very good way for students to not be so tied up with grades. So this is really something I think that works very well for us. At the same time, of course, we also have students who then complain because they don't get grades and they can't show that they're better than anyone else. So that's then the backside of this. And as a third point, I just again want to go back to what Simon was also saying about this idea of sometimes giving students also the room for failing, especially in such a process-oriented learning method like problem-based learning or also simulation. So this idea that we learn best once we sit there and actually tried it the wrong way. And that's really something, again, where we see a tension between having to assess everything and being able to show how we assessed it, while at the same time giving students the space to dare to fail and taking this possibility sometimes to go a bit further and just try. And what we observed there, Maastricht, was that this idea of reflective essays, like Simon also uses them in his simulation exercises, is really a very good way of also helping students to reflect on what they're doing. So these are my 3 points, but I'm sure perhaps also Galina and Lisanne have something to add on this.
Thank you. So just Galina, I see you raised your hand. Please.
No one correct answer within the problem-based learning. There might be different correct possible outcomes in European law, how to solve the problem, and what is possible and valuable to access is the way how students contribute, how much they contribute. And also, I fully agree with Anatoly. He wrote in the chat that contributions and presentations, these are the most important methods when we talk about the assessment tools within the problem-based learning. As presentations, they help to improve all possible skills, including the oratory skills and presentation of a lawyer or a student of political science. About multiple choice tests and just tests within the assessment procedure for the PBL, I'm not sure. We don't use it in Ukraine, tests for PBLs. But as a result of my experience when I was an LLM student in the UK, when we started the problem-based learning preparation, so there were 2 assessments. As you know, the problem-based learning, as I have already told you, we have 2 parts. The first part when we are supplied with the problem and we analyze it and make learning objectives. So we are assessed by the way of how we are thinking and how we contribute during the lecture. And then the second part of PBL starts after our examination elaboration of the problem at home, and how we provide feedbacks on the seminar sessions. So we are assessed with the same problem, but the second time, how the research, how deeply the research was done, and how we found the correct solution of the problem. But we have about 4 or 5 PBLs per term, and the first couple of PBLs can be done with the help of the tutor in the classroom, but then the final PBL might be done as a written paper. So we do not discuss and analyze everything in the class. This is just like a check. It can be also used within the exam procedure when there is a written paper, and students, keeping in mind those 7 steps of PBL process that we have already experienced in the class and at home. So within that structure, you have by yourself to hold all the procedure and to present the PBL and to find the correct solution. That was used in the UK. So during the exam, you can be provided 2 PBL problems, and the students, by his or her choice, will decide which PBL problem he will decide to analyze in the written paper for about 2 hours. Or if it is a home task for students for final home exam, then they can be just supplied by the problem and email the correct answer. So I may sum up that when we talk about the methods for PBLs, contributions in the class, presentations in the class, and written paper at the end of the term might be also the possible method of assessment of problem-based learning. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Karina. Now, I would like to give the floor to Alexandra, who would continue on question 2 on behalf of Blended Learning Group.
I think Lizana asked to raise her hand to say something as well before.
Sorry if I missed it. Go ahead, Lizane.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. Yeah, I just wanted to add something, not very long, because already a lot has been said. I cannot reflect on my own teaching experience with PBL because I haven't practiced it with a group. But it's interesting that if we go to question 3, feedback, there we have the categories of formative and summative feedback, and I think that actually the same counts for assessment, that you have the formative and summative assessment, so you can assess the learning during the process as well as assess the final results of a student by means of an exam, or for example a portfolio of work that the students have to submit. And when you think of the learning during the process, then you can actually for each session, for example, ask the students to do some homework or prepare some written reflection. And then I also like the idea of Simon to really connect it to the future professional environment of the students, so that actually they are a bit more stimulated to participate. Thanks.
Thank you. Now, Alex.
Okay, I was contemplating whether to go on with a few ideas from e-learning and then to summarize, but meanwhile there will be a lot of new things on the chat. So, well, I think nevertheless I'll come up with a few ideas, and you can go on with the e-learning assessment, how to assess in e-learning and blended learning then, and I'll continue to follow the chat and summarize then. So just a few ideas from our side. Of course, in the case of e-learning, the assessment is also quite challenging. A few of the things that were already mentioned by Simon and Heidi obviously apply as well. But there are some other issues that come up as well. Well, in e-learning and blended learning, we tend to say at least that we are using innovative technologies in teaching and learning, but these are not always matched by suitable assessment tools. So we often, like in our case here at the VUB, at the IES, we are inviting students for a face-to-face exam after they took their courses online. So of course, that is not necessarily incorrect or bad practice, but I wouldn't say it's the best practice either, because obviously, like I said before, what we want to test are their skills of managing information online, managing their presence online. So I think interactions and so on. So I think those things should be taken into account when we assess as well. How do we do it? Well, of course, I think testing through the learning process and self-testing for the student is very important. So we use some sort of self-tests on our platform that students can take while they are studying to see their own progress, and we see that as well. Then we also we also need to try to assess the students' skills in finding information, referencing information they find online. So exactly what I explained before, kind of managing the information they find online. And these you can do either through sort of web quests where they meant to show how they found specific information, but also maybe screencasts also showing how they follow a specific thread of information online, maybe self-made videos as well showing that on how they found the information and how they use it. Again, assessment through the process of learning. I think I would go also for weekly tasks instead of just a final exam. So tasks that the students can manage independently, also linked to the self-discipline that I mentioned in the beginning, because of course question 1 and question 2 were separated now for practical reasons, but they cannot be separated. You see, we always link it, what we want to assess with and how we assess it. So weekly tasks measure, well, kind of spreading the various topic, the various subject matter across the various study weeks and assessing week by week. Maybe also oral exams, again via online virtual platform like this one, or Skype if that's not possible, just to test how the students are interacting in an online environment as well. That can be done also in a possible group work in breakout rooms, in a webinar setup as well. So there are quite a few ideas that can be used in e-learning. I'm sure Natalia will add some more. Now I see that I lost track of a lot of from the chat, but there were a few points that I wanted to make, and I think they're just being reinforced. I'll check in a second. Of course, various assessment means were discussed. First of all, the multiple choice tests. They were already mentioned when we were still discussing the former question. Of course, if you want to check factual knowledge, they might be enough. But if you want to, of course, check and assess the students' analytical skills, that is definitely not enough. Then essays were discussed. A lot of you prefer essays. Of course, Max mentioned how he's grading his essays. I think everyone agrees that precise criteria and precise marking scales for the essays are very important, and that should be also made transparent to the students. I would add grading systems were discussed. Again, very different grading scales in the various universities. Simon mentioned peer review, which is also very interesting, very important. Again, could be linked to assessing performance, something we talked about before. Students assess each other's performance. Again, something a bit more tricky, can come up with new issues there rather than solve a lot of the problems. Also, final assessment versus assessment throughout the process, group presentations, group work, and so on, engagement in the classroom. So how do we balance all this? Then, of course, I think very important points were made by Heidi when she introduced her topic. I think it's very important to give feedback, to use the time efficiently, and maybe rather than focus on trying to find individual types of assessment, just use the time to give feedback. And maybe we could just also contemplate not really focusing on grades, but maybe using some other pass or fail or some other options if our universities allow us to, because that might be quite interesting. I'll check what was written meanwhile, but meanwhile you can continue discussing. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Alex. So just to continue and reflect more specifically with regard to the blended learning, if I may share my experience with different assessment tools, when I designed my first blended learning course, I had a group of 15 students, which offered me several advantages with organizing online problem-based tutorials. So I could organize, for example, the pre-discussion and the post-discussion using asynchronous and synchronous tools like video conferencing. But the different assessment tools I used varied really in order to combine the assessment of skills including something like research skills. As one of the tools I used was a group research project, like a 1 week long group research project within which the different groups had to interact online and work in order to produce a report by the end of the week, which they had to present on Friday via video conference, and all the others were providing feedback via chat. And then another way of assessing was by combining this assessment of the collaborative work, which is specific to the PBL, and basically the teamwork, but also more specifically how active the participants were in posting comments online. And I must say that although this was not directly assessed, the writing skills is one of the things that also matters a lot when we talk about blended learning and asynchronous communication, because the literature also shows this as one of the advantages of blended learning, that posting online contributions leads to a more careful consideration of the question and the comments, and also structures the thinking and the writing. So critical thinking is encouraged when students are posting online their contributions, and even if they are participating in a more asynchronous way via chats or forums, for example, this is one of the advantages that the blended learning, for example, gives. Other types of assessments, I agree that whenever possible, when we deal with a blended learning course, it is good to have some weekly assessments. This really helps to be basically constantly in touch with the students, to guide them and to tell them whether or not they are on the right track, to give them this more formative assessment, formative feedback. And peer assessment is one of the tools that I have seen being used quite commonly within the blended learning courses or online learning courses. Now, Heidi was saying earlier that from her experience, students did not like it at all, grading each other. Yeah, perhaps it also depends on how flexible we are with the grading scale, for example, like the discussion was until now, or with whether we can grade basically as a pass versus fail the course participation, which I could see gives students a bit more freedom of expressing themselves. Another way of encouraging peer feedback or assessment is, for example, in my course I used research reports, and the students were encouraged to read each other's reports and basically grade each other's reports. And I think this is a valuable tool, but it is always worth asking how exactly this peer assessment would contribute to the course objectives, and what weight this peer assessment tool will have as compared to other assessment tools regarding the final grade of the course. So that would be it from my side regarding the blended learning more specifically. And I would like to see if there is anything else worth saying, summarizing from the chat, or are we good to move to the third question?
Just a few words from the chat. I had a look, and of course a lot of discussion on the grading scales and so on, and having separate ones for master and undergraduate and so on. Interesting discussions. Of course, it differs from country to country, even from university to university. But two or three more thoughts. I think Anna mentioned how to balance, very interestingly, how to balance the grade-seeking behavior of students and the idea of giving formative feedback instead of just grades. I think that's a very interesting thing to keep in mind, and that's an issue we are all facing now. I think that the students are very focused on receiving grades and comparing each other and so on. Of course, a lot of discussion about peer assessment, but meanwhile, of course, Natalia was also tackling this, so I won't mention too much on it. Maybe just that Anatoly, I think, mentioned that perhaps it's more efficient if it's done anonymously, that students might feel more at ease to assess each other's pieces anonymously. But I think there was evidence from all sides differing. Some of you said that it works very well, even non-anonymously, that students really benefit from each other's feedback and also from giving feedback to each other. So I think that's very important. Maybe it's useful to try to use this. And then a lot of discussion was whether on essays and whether they really are the right tool to assess critical thinking. They do help us assess analytical skills, but do they actually help us also assess critical thinking, and what would be the best tool to assess critical thinking? Perhaps discussions, problem solving, that would be better than simply an essay. I think there were already some comments related to feedback. So I think now we're going to make the transition to the third question on feedback.
Thank you, Alex. So we are moving to our third question. Just an update from the blended learning group. Our group training participants are somehow I believe for them it's a bigger challenge to reflect on their teaching practice since most of them are new with the blended learning tools and methods. And basically we welcome your comments anyway on your teaching experience regarding the assessment tools and methods that you have been using for your ordinary courses. So basically we can exchange ideas also based on your previous experience, or you can reflect also on how you perceive as a challenge to use one or another assessment method or tool within the blended learning environment. If we are to talk about the third question, perhaps I would volunteer now to continue and talk about question 3 on behalf of the blended learning group. What I believe is important is to have somehow a balanced assessment scheme that would include a formative feedback and also summative feedback, because especially in the case of the blended learning group, formative feedback makes also student thinking visible to instructors and colleagues, and it is crucial in blended learning because step-by-step guidance from the instructor is crucial for the success of the blended learning. And if we are to talk about the specific ways how the feedback may be given within the blended learning format, then first of all, we talk about the email as one of the main tools of providing feedback, both individual feedback and group feedback. And then moving beyond the synchronous tools of offering feedback, then whenever possible, using some form of audio or video feedback. For example, when we talk about students' performance, and if we want to engage somehow to provide this human factor to our interaction, then audio and video feedback via Skype, for example, is also useful. And Alexandra, I know, can share a bit more about these virtual office hours that they have been using successfully at the IS. In my case, when I was implementing the blended learning course, I have been rather flexible and open for student queries, but also providing my step-by-step feedback, both in between the different activities by email, approaching students individually, or basically like coaching whenever was needed, or by providing my feedback as a tutor at the end of each session. And as feedback is important in general for the problem-based learning, for example, when using online PBL tutorials, I have been always leaving some time, like around 10 minutes at the end of the session, to ask for the group feedback on the performance of the session and ask for ways how the interaction, particularly this kind of online interaction before the tutorial and during the tutorial, how could it be improved, and learning, basically introducing some lessons as the course was going. So the advantage of the blended learning is that perhaps it can be more tailor-made, and of course it requires more effort from the instructor, but these kinds of lessons learned while the course is implemented can be introduced within the course design, and the course can be improved actually. So feedback is very valuable for the tutor. And especially if we talk about blended learning courses, most of the times, as we could see also from our online training participants, we are dealing with people within our project that aim at using blended learning perhaps for the very first time. So feedback is very crucial, formative feedback for the instructor, but also for the students once again. And just to give you some more specific ideas how the feedback can be given, so we are talking about individual feedback by email, audio, video, or basically coaching when preparing a particular, for example, a research project, a group project. But also we talk about the peer feedback, which is very important. For example, at the end of each session or after group presentations, after the presentation of different projects, quick exchange of ideas, of feedback on how it went, ways of improving, virtual office hours, but also what is very important, I believe, is to use the opportunity of a face-to-face session sometime towards the end of the course in order to have a more open and more maybe spontaneous exchange of ideas between the students and between the tutor, which is also valuable for this community building and helps overcoming this fear of isolation, which is usually one of the challenges of the blended learning. Thank you. So who would like to continue regarding the feedback within the blended learning? Maybe some of our training participants, or also based on your experience within our group work, or how do you envisage the use of feedback within your potential future course, for example? Okay, Galina, please, the floor is yours.
To provide feedback within the problem-based learning, it is important to keep in mind that the feedback is a breakfast of champions, as it was said, and how the structure of feedback within the problem-based learning should be given is that first we have to address to the positive issues that students said, and then we state the issues that need to be improved, and we don't say that this is the negative experience of the students, but still we advise how their contribution could be improved and how their analysis can be improved. It is quite important to be specific when we give feedback for problem-based learning and to provide examples. It was said that it is possible to give feedback by email or in written form. I tend to think that we have a group discussion on the seminar. Me personally, I will give a feedback when students still keep in mind their contributions, and so the memory is still full of what they have just contributed, and to provide examples how their contributions could be improved. We will also discuss the group strategies if we have team working, and for example the problem-based learning, we have a group of 15 students and they were divided into 3 groups, and so we will compare the strategies that each group has followed, and then we will compare the approaches they followed and how the performance of these groups could be improved. So we will state the feedback clearly within the problem-based learning and follow up the issues that have to be identified. It was already told about the peer feedback, and I must say that we need to become aware of what works well within the problem-based learning and what could be improved. And the first step to improve the learning process within the problem-based learning. Of course, not the experience will be made by the students by themselves, but that's really that they can learn tremendously by observing and providing feedback to each other. And I must say personally, a tutor may also learn when the students make presentations, and me personally, sometimes I learn how the students present any information, and this is like that you see yourself, but from different side. So I must say that within the problem-based learning, I see that this is the most important things for feedback. Starting from the positive, then move to the improvement with specific examples, strategies, improvement of performance. There is also thought that within the problem-based learning, you can have a weekly teaching journal about inputs, contributions of the discussions, and also the roles of each student in the group. And within this strategy, the students can follow how their role changed, and the dynamics of how they started the PBL at the beginning of the term, how they were involved, the percentage of their participation, and also how their behavior may be changed and how active they became. Because usually at the beginning of the term, when the PBL process is new for students, they're very passive, and sometimes it's hard for a tutor to increase their activity and to start making contributions, be active. So within the feedback at the end of the term, it is quite important when we talk about the group learning. Me personally, I use email feedbacks when I have written papers. Then it will be individual feedback of every student. But again, if you have a group work, I think that immediate feedback is much more useful than to write 15 emails and to provide individual feedbacks, because students can also learn on the mistakes of other students, and to learn to hear and the feedback of other students will also be useful for them. This is my opinion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kalina. Now, who would like to continue on question 3? Simon, Heidi?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I think just to pick up on Galina's point, I think the important thing with these kind of pedagogies is that you're creating a space where students are getting feedback all through the process in a much more obvious kind of way than you do with something like a lecture. That the actual process of interaction is part of the feedback process. Now, part of what we have to do then with students is to remind them that actually that feedback is feedback and that they should be paying attention to what other people are saying. I think one of the things we want to try and do is break down the hierarchy, that we're the only people who know what the answer is, and that students know nothing. So part of what we're doing with simulations, I think with PBL as well, is about getting students to recognize they can learn from each other and get feedback from each other. So there's a process within the pedagogy that is about feedback. The other thing I think is very important, particularly from a simulation perspective, is not so much feedback as debrief. That because simulations tend to draw people in, often they're not really thinking, they're not stepping back from what they've done. And so a key part of the feedback process is getting students to talk about what they've experienced. So drawing it out of them without saying this is what you must have learned, but rather saying, well, what happened, is a really important thing for them. So again, going back to Ihor's comments, just talking about when in the simulation game we've been playing online, he always thinks that the country he represents is Ukraine, which it isn't. Honest. Again, the way in which you get drawn into thinking about how that role should be is actually an intrinsic part of what we're doing, and so if you don't discuss it, then you tend to lose it. So it's really important to have that process of drawing people back into the real world, or at least the real world of academia and university life, so that they can start to structure their thoughts and put it together. So feedback comes from us, but it also comes from peers, and it also comes from the student themselves. So actually, I'd say that certainly in simulations, I'd say probably our feedback probably comes third in that list. That the first person who really matters is the student themselves. If they can't see what they've done, then actually what anyone else says is very secondary. That you need to try and make that connection. So I think it's important that we recognise doing that. Thinking about the feedback assessment kind of distinction, I think it's important. I've given you that link to our university's grade descriptors, which everyone says looks very interesting. But it doesn't actually mean anything. It's a way to make us, if I say it, my boss is nearby. It makes us look as though we're being very objective in what we're doing. All assessment is subjective to a degree, often to a considerable degree. So this is a way for us to have something to be confident that we are being rational and objective in what we do. But there are clearly limitations. So, the difference between a 66 and a 67, doesn't actually mean anything. So we have to be very careful that these, the grades we give back, and just say, look at the grade descriptors, doesn't really tell students very much. And that's why the feedback of what we do, it really matters. So feedback should be talking about what's happened, but also about how students can build on that. So it always needs to be constructive. We have this slightly strange thing where we write feedback forms for our dissertations for the students the dissertations that students do, even though that's at the very end of their degree. They usually get it after they finish studying with us. They might never do a dissertation again, but actually it's still a useful thing for them to think about how they work in that kind of piece of assessment. So again, we always need to think about the formative developmental side. And if we think that summative assessment is just a grade, then we really miss something, because usually students are going to be doing some other piece of assessed work after they finished a particular module or a particular course. So we need to think, well, what are the useful lessons they can take from this, rather than forgetting about it when it's all done.
Thank you very much, Simon. Who would like to take the floor now? Please, Heidi.
Okay, thank you. I just wanted to follow up because while Simon was talking, I was really thinking about this debrief, in this moment of just giving students this half an hour, just to together assess what actually had happened, and to in the end allow them to think of what they observe and also to assess it first by themselves. So I think that's always a very important moment. And one experience that we had in Maastricht was that sometimes we hadn't scheduled time for this. So not necessarily for the debrief, but also in the PBL tutorial. So what we see a lot with problem-based learning, that we try to give feedback on group work, but also individual learning. But when a group didn't work so well, everyone panicked, and we tried to make sure they cover the content instead of taking this hour of a break and just saying, okay, what is actually happening on this meta level? And to talk also with students of how they learn, and in the end, what they want to change about it. And that was really a very important reflection that we had as staff members, that in order for feedback to happen, you also really have to create the space and the time. And sometimes it has to be moderated, but sometimes it can also be according to what students need. But I think then it's very important that one really also, as an instructor, creates this space where students feel safe to reflect on what they're doing. Perhaps just as a short follow-up, so I think what we see in terms of feedback very much in a PBL environment is, on the one hand, of course, the feedback and content, but for the rest, we focus really very much in the first 2 years on how to use tutorials for individual learning and how to improve group dynamics. So that's really something we see that's really very central for using problem-based learning. I will leave it at that, I would say.
Thank you, Heidi. Alex, anything worth summing up from our online chat?
Few things coming up on chat, quite a few interesting things linked, of course, to what we were talking. First of all, interesting question from Lizanne was, is assessment, what is the difference between assessment and feedback? Does one include the other? Of course, the answer is it should. Simon gave a very nice definition there, but it's not always the case, unfortunately. Sometimes grades just come without a lot of explanation. And then it's also the question whether you give the feedback at the end, just what Simon was saying now, would that be constructive and helpful for the future? It always is, but I think it's much better, as Heidi mentioned in the chat at some point, the timing of the feedback. The earlier, the better, that it actually has a chance, that the students have the chance to use the feedback to improve their learning while they are doing the course. Natalia mentioned, I think, that the feedback can also be not connected to a formal assessment form. So it's not necessarily in relation to an exam or to a test you have, but for different tasks. So not necessarily linked to a formal assessment. It can be, but it's not necessary. Then, of course, Heidi mentioned that in the case of PBL, you always test not only, well, you always give feedback not only on what has been learned, but also on the group dynamic and how the individuals learn in a group. And I think that's very important. That's very important in the case of simulations, I would imagine, as well, and any active learning method. Ihor mentioned that the feedback and assessment and the combination of feedback and assessment and the balance and the amount of each depends on the number of students, of course. If you have a lot of students, you will not be able to give individual feedback, even though you know that that might be better. So that's a little bit, there are some constraints there as well that you have to take into account. Of course, from what Simon said, I would just take, I think, 1 or 2 points. The one of constructive feedback I mentioned already. And the other one that, of course, I think that applies to all our pedagogical methods. Students have to know that they can learn from each other as well. They have to be reminded of that the teacher is not the only one that has the final answer, the only answer, and the truth. So learning from each other and teaching students to learn from each other and to give each other feedback is very important. And just one thing to finish with, I think was mentioned before, probably in the context of the last question, but I think it's relevant for this one as well. Teaching staff needs training to do the assessment and to give feedback. It doesn't come automatic. We see now how many opinions, how many different ideas we have. Again, none of us holds the final answer and the best answer, but I think it's important to learn from each other, and that's exactly what we've been doing in this webinar.
Thanks a lot. We have managed basically to cover a lot of very interesting points and some of the main challenges in providing feedback and assessment. And I am very grateful to see the activity on the chat, but also the exchange of opinions between the group leaders. And since we still have some more time remaining until the end of our webinar, I would like to open the floor for any volunteer to talk, or if you prefer writing your contributions, we will make sure that we will read them for you in case if you prefer that. Alex, you still want to say something, or you just forgot to remove the hand button. Then perhaps we could have a Lizanne, go ahead.
Maybe just to repeat what I already also wrote in the chat. I think that that giving feedback is somehow means to really showing interest in the student, and I think it can really motivate all students to do a bit more. And if you really show care for a person, I think in any way that is very stimulating. And especially this individual approach, that you not just tell something to the whole group, but you actually you specify the information you want to share with one person. Yeah, that was it.
Thank you very much. Perhaps before I would provide a more general conclusion to today's webinar, I would like to ask if the group leaders would prefer to give a short, basically, conclusion with regard to their specific group, or shall we go for a more general conclusion from my side? What would you prefer? Okay, Simon says more general. Okay, so let me then start to briefly summarize our today's discussion by thanking all of you for being actively involved. It was a pleasure to see that as we advanced with our webinars, also we got a bit more structure, and that basically raising 3 specific questions and keeping this time dimension of around 20 to 25 minutes for each question worked well this time. I am glad that we could have an active exchange of ideas about the different assessment procedures, about the challenges with offering formal, informal feedback, including it within different assessment tools. If I may summarize, basically one of the main discussions we had regarding the different assessment tools was to what extent we can control for the subjective aspect of assessing, basically, or giving feedback. And while many of us are widely using essays, for example, or papers, there was also basically an agreement that one of the challenges is also to control for this more subjective dimension of grading. There was also a vivid discussion of the multiple choice assessment tool within the social sciences, with some skeptical views on to what extent this is useful for our disciplines, especially if we talk about European studies. Well, from my point of view, as a last contribution on this subject, I would like to say that I strongly believe that we have to basically include different types of assessment tools, continuous assessment, in order to balance, for example, the knowledge assessment with some more flexible, for example, performance or skills assessment. If we talk about PBL or simulations, the use of self-reflections, for example. But I believe that it is possible to complement the different assessment tools in order to have more objective, for example, straightforward answers, like multiple choice assessment, or to have a more relaxed, more individual, personal opinion, like a position paper or an essay, where we can allow this freedom of individual contribution. However, it might mean also some degree of subjectivity because of the challenge of putting some very specific, clearly defined guidelines for grading across the different essays, for example. And last but not least, the time that it requires from us as instructors for grading the different essays. So it always depends on the size of the group also. So if we may come to the role of the feedback based on our discussion and just the freshly raised points, feedback is very important whether or not it is part of the formal assessment procedure or not. Feedback helps students to reassure them from the side of instructors that they get the things right, that they are on the right track, and also feedback from the students, whether informal or more formal, like peer assessment, for example, is also welcome, and it helps to have this community building, and especially when we talk about online courses and the challenge of blended learning or e-learning courses. Feedback is a #1 thing to take into account when designing a course and while implementing it, because the lack of feedback also leads to the lack of motivation on the part of the students to be actively involved. So on this note, I would like to thank you once again, and unless there are some further colleagues that would like to present their own conclusions, I would like to end today's discussion.
Thank you very much to everyone contributing and participating in the webinar. It was very interesting. See you next one.
Just as a reminder, we will have our last webinar. Alex, help me with the date. Is it 15th of December?
It is 15th of December. We will
15th
communicate
of
that
December,
again
the
in
same
written.
time. Yes.
It
the
will be
same
on
time.
discussing, brainstorming about the presentations to be done in Georgia.
Yeah, so thanks a lot. The webinar has been recorded. Please pass a message to your colleagues that could not be here with us, and especially I would like to ask the local project coordinators to tell your local colleagues involved in the training that they can follow the webinar. Silvio will shortly come back to you regarding the link where you can access the recorded webinar. So thanks a lot and have a nice evening.